The fluorescent lights in the conference room felt colder than usual that morning. My manager slid a printed email across the table. A photo someone had taken of my car, parked outside a building on Lambton Quay 3 Saturdays in a row. "We have a conflict of interest policy for a reason," she said. "You've been doing paid work for an outside organization while employed here full-time. That's a breach of your contract." Beside her, the HR coordinator kept her eyes on her notebook, pen moving. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just looked at that photo and felt something strange. Not dread, but the particular calm that comes when a thing you've been dreading for a long time finally just happens. "You're right," I said. "I should focus on one role." I watched confusion flicker across both their faces. They'd expected me to defend myself. What they didn't know, what they hadn't bothered to ask, was which outside organization I'd been visiting, they assumed. And that assumption was going to cost them more than they could calculate in that room. My name is Kiri. Until 40 minutes before I'm telling you this, I was the sole data systems analyst at a mid-sized financial advisory firm in Wellington, 26 years old, 3 years into a job that had quietly become 4 jobs rolled into one, paid for one. I walked out of that building into a Tuesday morning in April with a box of desk things, a succulent that had survived 3 Wellington winters, and my phone buzzing with a message from someone I'd been working with every other Saturday for the past 2 months. The board approved it. "Full contract, your terms. When can you start?" I typed back, "Today, actually." Let me tell you how it started, because the beginning matters. I came to this firm fresh out of Victoria University with a data science degree and the specific kind of ambition that comes from being the first in your family to work in an office. My grandmother had been a cleaner. My mom worked the checkout at a New World for 15 years. I wanted to build something different, and this job felt like the door. The offer letter said I'd be joining a data team of 4. By the time I showed up for my first day, there were 2 of us, me and a senior analyst named Dex, who was already halfway out the door and who left 3 months later for a role in Sydney. They didn't replace him. They said they were assessing resourcing needs. That assessment never concluded. For a year, I held everything together and told myself it was temporary. The firm had about 240 clients, ranging from private individuals to small business portfolios. Every quarterly report, every compliance filing, every risk assessment model, all of it ran through systems I maintained. Our client database had been migrated 3 years before I arrived, and the migration had been sloppy, leaving behind about a dozen legacy data pipelines that required manual reconciliation every single month. I documented this. I flagged it in writing every quarter. I offered 3 separate times to fix it properly if I could have 1 uninterrupted week and a small development budget. The response was always some version of, "You're managing it fine." I was managing it fine the way a person manages a slow leak in their ceiling by moving the bucket. It wasn't fixed. It was just contained, by me, personally, at the cost of working most Sunday mornings and answering emails at 11 at night. When I asked for a pay review at the 18-month mark, my manager, I'll call her my manager because that's all she was by then, told me the firm was in a holding pattern. When I asked what that meant, she said budgets were under review following the acquisition. When I asked again at 2 years, she said they valued my contribution enormously and were working on a package. What arrived 6 weeks later was a $500 superannuation top-up and a thank you card signed by people I barely recognized. I want to be clear. I tried. I really did. I wrote a business case for a second analyst. I presented it with a full cost-benefit analysis. Because that's what I do. I work with numbers, and the numbers were unambiguous. The risk of single-point failure in our data infrastructure, combined with the compliance requirements under the new financial services legislation, meant that 1 resignation or 1 extended illness would create a reporting gap that could draw regulatory attention. I laid it all out. 2 pages, clear headings, specific dollar figures. My manager said she'd raise it at the next leadership meeting. I never heard back. That winter, I attended a data governance conference in Wellington the firm sent me because it was free with our industry membership and nobody else wanted to go. That's where I met the woman who would eventually change everything. She led a session on data ethics, and I stayed after to ask her a question about audit trail architecture. We ended up talking for 2 hours in the conference center foyer. She ran a small but well-regarded financial technology consultancy, the kind that advised nonprofits and community finance organizations on how to build systems that didn't collapse the moment their one technical person left. She asked if I'd ever done any advisory work. I said no. She said she had a project that needed someone with exactly my background, strictly weekend hours, no conflict with my employment. It was a community development trust, not even adjacent to my firm's client base. The work was reviewing their data governance framework and helping them build something that didn't depend on a single person to maintain. The irony was not lost on me. I checked my contract carefully. The conflict of interest clause applied to work for direct competitors or clients. A community trust was neither. I said yes. For 8 weeks, I spent my Saturdays in a quiet office on Lambton Quay, helping a small organization build the kind of resilient, documented, transferable system I had begged my own firm to invest in. I was paid well, treated like an expert, and asked for my opinion before decisions were made. I came home from those Saturdays feeling like a different person. Someone from my firm saw my car. Someone made assumptions. Someone decided that was enough. They didn't ask what I was doing there. They didn't check what organization the building housed. They just saw a pattern car, same location, 3 Saturdays, and drew a line to a conclusion that felt tidy and gave them a reason to act. What they'd actually decided, though I didn't know it at the time, was that I'd become inconvenient. There'd been talk of restructuring, making the data function leaner. I found this out later from a colleague who messaged me after the news got around. They'd been looking for a reason. I handed them one that turned out to be no reason at all, but by then it was done. I drove home that Tuesday and called my mum. I told her I'd been let go and that I thought it was going to be okay. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "You always know more than they give you credit for," which is the most mum thing she has ever said to me and which I have thought about 100 times since. I signed a full-time contract with the consultancy by Friday afternoon. The role was head of data systems, a team of 5, a salary that made me sit down when I read it. I started the following Monday, and then I waited. Not with malice, I want to be honest about that. I wasn't sitting at my new desk counting down to disaster, but I knew what was coming. The way you know a Wellington southerly is coming, when the clouds start stacking over the Rimataka Range. You don't cause the weather, you just know how to read it. The firm's quarterly compliance filings were due in 11 days. There were 4 manual reconciliation processes that had to be run in the right sequence before the data could be extracted and formatted for filing. Each one had a dependency on the previous one. None of them were automated. The documentation I'd written described what to do, but not the logic underneath each step, not the historical anomalies in the legacy pipelines that required specific overrides, not the 3 exceptions I'd built in by hand that had no record anywhere except in my own working notes, which I'd kept in a personal folder I took with me when I left. I'd offered to walk someone through it. 18 months earlier, I'd asked to spend 2 hours training whoever they wanted to designate as backup. Nobody had time. The documentation was sufficient, they said. I left the documentation. It was accurate. It just wasn't complete, because complete would have required someone to sit down with it and ask questions, and nobody had ever done that. The first call came 8 days after I left. It was my manager. Her voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, careful, like someone walking on ice. There was a small issue with the reconciliation process, she said. The team had followed the documentation, but one of the outputs wasn't matching. Could I point them in the right direction? I said I was focused on my new role and wished them well. 2 days later, someone from the operations team called from an unknown number. They'd tried the process twice, and the variance report was throwing an error they couldn't interpret. Compliance filing was in 3 days. They were, and this is the word they used, concerned. I said I hoped they could work it out. The day before the filing deadline, I had 4 missed calls, 2 emails, and a LinkedIn message from a director I'd never once spoken to in 3 years of employment. It was friendly, the LinkedIn message. Chatty even. It mentioned that there seemed to be a documentation gap and asked whether I might have time for a quick call. I did not reply. I want to say something here, because I know how this part sounds. I know it sounds like I was letting them suffer, and I won't pretend I felt nothing. I am human. And yes, somewhere underneath the professionalism and the new job adrenaline, there was a small, mean satisfaction in knowing they were finally feeling the weight of what I'd been carrying alone for 3 years. But that's not why I didn't answer. I didn't answer because I had a new job that deserved my full attention. I had a team meeting every morning. I had systems to learn. I had a manager who asked me how I was settling in and actually waited for the answer. Every hour I gave to the old firm was an hour I was taking from the organization that had valued me enough to make space for me. That didn't feel fair to them. The compliance filing missed its deadline. I only know this because it became a matter of public record. The Financial Markets Authority publishes late filing notices. My mum sent me a screenshot with a single raised eyebrow emoji. After that, the calls changed in character. It wasn't my manager anymore. It was the managing director. His voicemail was short and didn't pretend to be friendly. There were regulatory implications, he said. A formal review had been triggered. He was prepared to discuss consulting terms. I let it sit for 2 days. I talked to my new boss about it. She'd become someone I trusted quickly, the way you trust a person who doesn't make you guess where you stand. She said it was my decision entirely. Professionally, helping them didn't put us in a difficult position. Personally, I didn't owe them anything. That night, I rang my grandmother, who is 73 and has never used a computer, but who has a way of cutting through things. I explained the situation. There was a silence, and then she said, "Do they know you could fix it?" "Yes," I said. "Do they know you will?" I didn't answer that. "That's your leverage," she said. "Not revenge. Leverage. Use it to fix something that matters." So I called the managing director the next morning. I kept my voice level. I told him I was available on a consulting basis. My rate was $3,000 per hour, minimum 8-hour engagement, payment in advance. Before he could respond, I told him I also had conditions. He said, "What conditions?" I said, "First, I work remotely. I don't come back to that building." He said that was fine. I said, "Second, I provide instructions only. Your team implements. I don't touch your systems directly." He said that was workable. I said, "Third, before I begin, you put in writing and share it publicly on your website an acknowledgement that the single analyst structure was identified as a critical risk, that risk was documented and flagged repeatedly, and that the responsibility for the gap in capability rests with management decisions, not with any individual contributor." There was a silence that lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. That would be an unusual statement," he said. "It would be an accurate one," I said. "And it would cost you significantly less than a regulatory penalty." Fourth, I told him, the data analyst role gets properly resourced. 2 qualified analysts, market salaries, access to a development environment to clean up the legacy pipelines, not reviewed next quarter, done within 60 days. And fifth, the staff who were laid off in the restructuring last year receive proper severance and written references that reflect their actual contributions. He said he needed to consult with the board. I said I'd be available for another 30 minutes. He called back in 22. The agreement was put in writing before noon. The payment cleared that afternoon. I spent the rest of the day writing a step-by-step recovery guide and then took my new team through it, not because they needed it, but because it felt like the right way to process it, to turn it into something useful rather than something I just carried. The consultation took 6 hours. I was on video call, speaking clearly, explaining not just what each step did, but why the history behind each legacy quirk, the decisions that had been made before I'd even arrived that had created the mess in the first place. The team implementing on the other end were asking good questions. They were fast. They had context because they'd been living in the system for 10 days trying to understand it. By 9 that evening, the filing was submitted. Late, with an explanatory note. The FMA review would continue, but the worst of it was contained. I closed my laptop and made a cup of tea and sat on my kitchen floor, which sounds strange, but my flat has very cold windows and the kitchen is warm, and that's where I go when I need to think. My old manager sent a personal email 2 days later. No legal language, just her. She said she was sorry for how things had been handled, that she'd raised the resourcing issue with leadership multiple times and been told to manage within existing budgets, that she should have pushed harder. It wasn't a complete accounting of everything, but it was something, and I replied briefly and said I appreciated her saying so. The public acknowledgement went up on the firm's website the following week. A short statement, careful in its wording, but clear. The firm had failed to adequately resource its data function, that risk had been identified internally and not acted upon, and that changes were being implemented. My name wasn't in it, I hadn't asked for that. The accountability was what mattered. 6 months after I was let go, I spoke at the same data governance conference where I'd first met my current boss. Different topic this time, building institutional knowledge that doesn't walk out the door when one person does. The session was full. People came up afterward with their own stories, variations on the same shape, one person carrying something critical, warnings going nowhere, a gap that only became visible when the person finally left. In the audience, I saw a face I recognized. One of the directors from my old firm. He was in the second row. He heard everything. After the session, a young woman, maybe 23, still new job energy, lanyard from a government agency, waited until the room had mostly cleared. She said she was the only analyst in her team. She said she'd been asking for support for a year. She asked what she should do. I thought about it for a moment. I said, document everything. Not to build a case for leaving. Do it so that if you do leave, or get sick, or take leave, the organization isn't helpless. Do it, because good documentation is an act of professional integrity, regardless of what they do with it. And if they won't resource the role properly after you've made the risk visible in writing, then the problem isn't you. It never was. She nodded like she was writing it down in her head. I'm telling this story now because I think it matters. Not as a revenge story, though I understand why it reads that way. I was 26 years old, good at my job, and I gave everything I had to an organization that took what I offered and called it sufficient without ever asking whether it was fair. I don't think I'm unusual. I think there are a lot of people doing exactly what I did, holding something critical together, raising their hand to say it's too much, being told they're managing fine. You are allowed to document your value in writing. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to name your rate. You are allowed to say, this is what I need before I help you. And the list of conditions reflects what should have been there from the beginning. The thing I keep coming back to is my grandmother's question. Not can you fix it, but what will fixing it actually change? If the answer is just gets them out of immediate trouble, maybe that's not enough reason. But if it means 2 analysts now have jobs with proper salary structures, and a public record exists that says management ignored documented risk, then fixing it means something. Then the crisis becomes the leverage that finally moves something that 2 years of polite internal advocacy couldn't shift. That's not revenge. That's using the only moment when you actually have power to do something structural with it. The consultancy where I work now has a principle we build into every data system we design. No process should be executable by only one person. If knowledge lives in a single brain, it's a liability, not an asset. We say this to clients who've just lost their one technical person and are panicking. We say it to organizations who want to understand why their systems keep failing. And I say it now in every talk I give, because it's the thing that's truest about all of it. Your expertise has worth that doesn't disappear when someone stops paying you for it. The right people will see it. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply build, clearly and visibly, the thing that the wrong people refuse to let you build while you were with them. If this resonated with something you've been sitting with, drop a comment. I'd genuinely like to hear it. Like and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And if you're the person currently holding something together that shouldn't rest on one pair of shoulders, this one was for you. There's something I've thought about a lot. Since all of this happened, the way consequences don't arrive dramatically, all at once, with music playing. They arrive quietly, in the shape of a missed deadline, a silent phone, a compliance notice that becomes a matter of public record. Nobody at that firm woke up one morning deciding to treat me poorly. It happened through 100 small decisions, each one reasonable sounding on its own. Not enough budget this quarter. She's managing fine. We'll reassess. And then one day the whole thing just ran out of road. I think about what my grandmother said when I rang her that night. She didn't ask whether I was angry or whether they deserved what was coming. She asked what fixing it would actually change. That question has stayed with me more than anything else about this whole experience, because it reframes everything. It moves you from the past, what they did, what you lost, to the future. What do you want to exist that doesn't exist yet? For me, the answer was 2 analysts with proper salaries, a public record that named the real problem, and 5 people who'd been quietly let go, finally getting the references they were owed. That was worth more to me than watching the filing stay broken. Not because I'm noble, I'm honestly not, but because I'd spent 3 years trying to get those things through the proper channels and getting nowhere. The crisis was the first moment I actually had enough leverage to make them happen. It felt wasteful not to use it. The thing about carrying something important alone for a long time is that it quietly changes how you see yourself. You start to mistake the weight for your identity. I was the person who kept it running. That felt like value, and in one sense it was. But it was also a trap. Because when I was gone, the weight didn't disappear, it just became visible. And visible weight, it turns out, is the only kind that organizations actually respond to. I don't think what happened to me was unusual. I think it happens constantly, in offices and clinics and schools and small businesses all over the place. One person quietly holding something together, raising their hand in meetings, writing things in emails, and being told they're doing great. The system relies on that person's integrity, their work ethic, their sense of responsibility, and sometimes mistakes those qualities for a reason not to change anything. So, if there's anything I'd say to someone sitting in the position I was in 3 years ago, it's this. Document everything. Not as a weapon, but as an act of professional honesty. Do the work well, because that's who you are. But don't let your competence become the excuse for someone else's negligence. Your ability to manage an impossible situation is not proof that the situation is acceptable. And if they fire you without asking the right questions, well, make sure you know the answers anyway.